Number 1. Luke Trudell. When police arrived at a rural outbuilding north of Marion, Iowa, on June 5, 2024, they found a scene so horrific it defied comprehension. 4 people lay deceased inside, their injuries so severe that responding officers initially struggled to understand what had happened. Sitting outside on the sidewalk, appearing dazed and disconnected from reality, was 35-year-old Luke Trudell. Within moments, he would utter a confession that would cement this case as one of the most disturbing in Iowa history. Luke Trudell had lived a relatively unremarkable life in Marion before that summer day. Working as a yard worker for T&K Roofing Company, based in Ely, he maintained steady employment and had minimal run-ins with the law. Just a criminal mischief charge from 2008 and an assault causing bodily injury from 2010. To those who knew him casually, nothing seemed particularly alarming. But beneath that ordinary exterior, something catastrophic was brewing, fueled by methamphetamine and spiraling delusions that would soon explode into violence. On that June morning, Trudell accompanied his father, Larry, to a property on Otter Road, planning to work on a boat. The property belonged to Lon Brown, father of one of the victims. 2 couples were staying on the premises at the time, Brent Brown, 34, and his girlfriend Kiana Ryan, 26, both from Cedar Rapids, along with Amanda Parker, 33, from Vinton, and her boyfriend, Ramondis Cooper, 44, also from Cedar Rapids. What should have been an ordinary day would transform into an unthinkable nightmare. Trudell had been awake for 2 consecutive days, smoking methamphetamine continuously. His grip on reality had deteriorated dramatically, replaced by a terrifying delusion. He had convinced himself that the 4 people staying on the property were involved in an elaborate trafficking conspiracy. In his drug-addled state, he believed he was carrying out some form of vigilante justice. The surveillance cameras mounted around the property would capture what happened next in chilling detail. The footage showed Trudell entering the outbuilding where Cooper and Ryan were staying. Minutes later, he emerged and followed Brent Brown and Amanda Parker as they entered the same structure, possibly responding to cries for help from inside. What occurred within those walls was methodical and brutal. Using a 42-inch metal pipe, Trudell struck each victim repeatedly, inflicting catastrophic blunt force trauma. The injuries were so severe that prosecutors would later describe them as comparable to high-velocity crashes, skull fractures, lacerations, devastating damage that left no chance of survival. When the bodies were discovered, emergency responders initially suspected carbon monoxide poisoning. That theory evaporated the moment they entered the outbuilding and confronted the grim reality. Trudell remained on scene, making no attempt to flee. His father, Larry, could be seen on surveillance footage, shouting for someone to call an ambulance, yelling in his son's face, demanding answers. Witnesses described Luke as appearing completely detached, mumbling incoherently, as though he couldn't comprehend what had just transpired. Officers initially treated Trudell as a potential witness, but during those first conversations, before being read his Miranda rights, he made statements that immediately shifted the investigation's focus. He told officers he had struck each victim. He directed them to the murder weapon. His DNA was found on the pipe's handle. The victim's blood coated the metal surface. Paint from the pipe was later discovered embedded in the victims' skulls. Blood spatter marked his clothing and shoes. The evidence was overwhelming and inescapable. Investigators learned that during later questioning, Trudell elaborated on his delusional reasoning, claiming his victims were involved in trafficking and that he wanted to take them all down. He admitted to feeling remorse and worried that his children would despise him for what he'd done. But perhaps most disturbing was a statement that was ultimately suppressed from trial. When asked why he had committed these acts, Trudell responded that the honest truth was he wanted to make a movie. Authorities found no evidence he had recorded the assault, making the statement even more chilling in its senselessness. Trudell's defense team attempted an audacious strategy. They pointed the finger at his father, Larry, suggesting the surveillance footage couldn't definitively prove which man had entered the outbuilding and carried out the attacks. They argued that police had developed tunnel vision, ignoring other investigative possibilities. They claimed officers had destroyed Larry Trudell's blood-stained clothing without proper testing, and that Luke's confession had been coerced while he was under the influence of methamphetamine. Larry Trudell never testified at trial, and investigators were unable to serve him with a subpoena. The prosecution countered with an ironclad case. Surveillance footage, DNA evidence, blood analysis, and Trudell's own admissions formed an unshakable foundation. After deliberating for more than 2 days following the 6-day trial in November 2024, the jury returned with their verdict. They found Trudell guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Brent Brown, Amanda Parker, and Kiana Ryan. For Ramondis Cooper's death, they convicted him of second-degree murder, likely believing there was insufficient evidence of premeditation in that initial attack. Cooper may have been the first victim, with the others killed because they could identify the perpetrator. On November 18, 2024, family members of the victims wept quietly and whispered thank you as the judge announced the guilty verdicts. Trudell will spend the remainder of his life behind bars, with sentencing scheduled for February 27, 2025. First Assistant County Attorney Monica Slaughter called it a huge win, though she admitted the lengthy deliberation had been nerve-wracking. For the families who lost loved ones in that rural outbuilding, the verdict provided some measure of justice, though nothing could restore what was stolen from them on that June morning. But if Trudell's case shocked Iowa with its senseless brutality and methamphetamine-fueled delusions, it was nothing compared to what investigators would uncover in another Iowa case, one where patience and cutting-edge science would finally solve a mystery that had haunted Cedar Rapids for nearly 4 decades. Number 2. Jerry Burns. 39 years is a long time to wait for answers. Long enough for parents to pass away without ever knowing who took their daughter from them. For nearly 4 decades, the name Michelle Martinko remained synonymous with one of Iowa's most frustrating mysteries, until a discarded drinking straw in a Manchester restaurant changed everything. Michelle Marie Martinko was everything an 18-year-old should be: vibrant, talented, and full of dreams. A senior at Kennedy High School in Cedar Rapids, she excelled academically while twirling batons, performing in school choirs and theater productions, and working part-time at Westdale Mall. Her sights were set on Iowa State University, where she planned to study interior design. Friends described her as sweet and genuinely kind, someone without enemies or conflicts. December 19, 1979, began like any ordinary winter evening. Michelle attended a banquet for the Kennedy Concert Choir, dressed elegantly in a black jersey dress and white rabbit fur jacket. Afterward, she drove her family's 1972 Buick Electra to Westdale Mall for a simple errand, picking up a winter coat her mother had placed on layaway. Friends spotted her inside around 7 that evening. She should have been home within the hour. She never made it back. At 4 a.m. on December 20th, mall security made a devastating discovery. Michelle's body was slumped in the front seat of the family Buick, still parked near J.C. Penney. She had been stabbed 29 times, concentrated on her face, neck, and chest. Her lungs and aorta were pierced. The fatal wound penetrated her heart, causing her to bleed to death. There were no signs of robbery, but evidence suggested she had fought desperately. And critically, her attacker had been injured during the struggle. Investigators found blood at the scene that didn't belong to Michelle. It was on her black dress and the car's gear shift. This was the killer's blood, left behind during the violent encounter. But this was 1979, decades before DNA technology would revolutionize criminal investigations. Police pursued every possible lead, interviewing Michelle's former boyfriends, friends, and the last person to see her alive. Every avenue led nowhere. The case descended into the coldest of cold files. Michelle's parents, Albert and Janet, died in 1995 and 1998 respectively, both never knowing who took their daughter's life. Then in 2006, Detective Doug Larison discovered something remarkable while reviewing case files. Blood scrapings from the gear shift had been tested for DNA years earlier, but nobody had followed up. He pushed for new testing on both samples. The Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation developed a full male DNA profile, the killer's genetic fingerprint, preserved for decades through careful evidence handling. The profile was uploaded to CODIS, the national DNA database. No matches came. In 2017, Cedar Rapids police reached out to Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia company specializing in DNA phenotyping. Using only genetic material, they created computer-generated images predicting what the suspect might look like. The images generated renewed interest, but no solid leads. Then came the breakthrough. Parabon's chief genetic genealogist suggested investigative genetic genealogy, the same technique that would later catch the Golden State Killer. In 2018, they uploaded the killer's DNA profile to GetMatch, a public genealogy website where people voluntarily share genetic data to find relatives. The database returned a hit, someone who shared DNA markers with the suspect, determined to be the killer's second cousin once removed. Parabon constructed elaborate family trees, working backward through generations. Investigators methodically contacted DNA-tested members of various branches, eliminating possibilities one by one. Eventually, they narrowed the suspect pool to 3 brothers who had grown up in Manchester, Iowa: Kenneth, Donald, and Jerry Burns. Police placed all 3 under surveillance, waiting for opportunities to covertly collect DNA samples. On October 29, 2018, investigators followed 64-year-old Jerry Lynn Burns to a Pizza Ranch restaurant. They watched him drink multiple sodas using a plastic straw. When Burns left, officers secured the straw and sent it for testing. The results were unequivocal. Burns' DNA matched the blood found on Michelle Martinko's dress. Less than 1 in 100 billion chance of a random match. On December 19, 2018, exactly 39 years to the day after Michelle's death, detectives arrived at Burns' powder coating business in Manchester. Burns appeared utterly emotionless during questioning. When shown computer-generated images created from his own DNA, he remarked they looked nothing like him. Investigators informed him they had collected his DNA from something he'd discarded. Burns denied involvement, but couldn't explain why his DNA would be at a 1979 crime scene. He hadn't known Michelle Martinko. He couldn't explain the connection. When pressed, Burns repeatedly responded, "Test the DNA." He was arrested that day. Jerry Lynn Burns had been 25 in December 1979, married with 2 young children, selling farm implements in Manchester. He'd worked for John Deere and co-owned a truck stop over the years. There was no apparent connection to Michelle. His name had never surfaced in the original investigation. He was invisible to detectives for nearly 4 decades, until science finally illuminated what had remained hidden. Burns hired prominent attorneys, including Kathleen Zellner, known for representing Stephen Avery. The defense challenged everything, arguing police had violated constitutional rights by collecting DNA without a warrant, claiming genealogy database searches were unconstitutional. Judges rejected these arguments, ruling Burns had no reasonable expectation of privacy once he abandoned the straw in a public restaurant. The trial began in February 2020 in Scott County. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence. DNA experts explained the astronomical odds. Perhaps most chilling was testimony from Michael Allison, a federal detainee who bunked near Burns while he awaited trial. Allison recounted Burns telling him he'd have to take him to the mall if he kept beating Burns at Chronicle, a disturbing reference to where Michelle died. Burns never took the stand. He sat expressionless throughout proceedings, his face unchanging. Jurors later noted his complete lack of emotion. After deliberating just 3 hours on February 24, 2020, they returned their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Michelle's sister Janelle and brother-in-law John Stonebreaker embraced as the verdict was read, tears streaming, relief mixed with profound sadness that Michelle's parents hadn't lived to see justice. On August 7, 2020, Burns was sentenced to life without parole. He briefly claimed somebody else had killed Michelle, then thanked his family for their support. In March 2023, the Iowa Supreme Court unanimously rejected his appeal, ensuring he would die behind bars. The Michelle Martinko case stands as a landmark in forensic science, one of the first major cold cases solved through genetic genealogy. Today, Michelle would have been in her early 60s. Instead, her legacy endures as proof that patience, preserved evidence, and scientific advancement can ultimately triumph over time. If Jerry Burns' arrest demonstrated how technology could resurrect long-dead cases, the next story proves that sometimes the most dangerous deception comes not from silence, but from someone pretending to speak on behalf of the dead. Number 3. Shana Goler. Dave Krupa's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Text after text, email after email, thousands of messages from a woman he dated for just 2 weeks. "I'm watching you," they read. "I have a key to your apartment." For 3 years, this digital torment consumed his life, forcing him to change phone numbers repeatedly, even relocating to another city. But here's what made this nightmare truly horrifying. The woman sending those messages had been deceased the entire time. In 2012, Dave Krupa was ready for a fresh start. The Omaha auto mechanic had recently ended his marriage and decided to explore online dating. He met Shana Goler, who went by Liz, through a dating website that summer. A single mother, she seemed perfect for something casual. Krupa made his intentions clear. He wasn't looking for commitment. Liz claimed she was perfectly fine with that arrangement. Several months later, 37-year-old Cari Farver walked into Krupa's auto shop to have her Ford Explorer serviced. The connection was immediate. Friends described Cari as vivacious and magnetic, someone who lit up any room. A single mother from Macedonia, Iowa, she worked in information technology. When Krupa asked her out, she made it equally clear she wasn't seeking anything serious. On one early date in November 2012, Cari spent the evening at Krupa's apartment. As she was leaving, she passed a woman in the hallway, Liz, who had dropped by unannounced. The two women's eyes met for perhaps 3 seconds. That fleeting encounter would alter both their lives forever. On November 13, 2012, Cari stayed overnight with Krupa. The next morning, he kissed her goodbye as she left for work. That was the last time anyone saw Cari Farver alive. Within hours, Krupa received a text from Cari asking whether they should move in together. When he declined, her tone shifted dramatically. She claimed to hate him, never wanted to see him again. The harassment escalated quickly. Messages poured in claiming Cari was watching him constantly, that she still possessed a spare key and let herself inside when he was away. Both Krupa and Liz received disturbing communications. Even Cari's mother, Nancy, received texts saying her daughter had moved to Kansas for a new job, leaving behind her 14-year-old son, Max. Nancy grew alarmed. The messages felt completely out of character. Cari missed her son's 15th birthday, her half-brother's wedding, Thanksgiving, and most tellingly, her father's funeral. Nancy reported her daughter missing, but authorities initially believed Cari had simply left voluntarily. The digital assault continued relentlessly. On November 15th, just 2 days after Cari disappeared, her employer received a text from her phone stating she was resigning and sending Shana Goler to replace her. Later that day, Liz applied for Cari's position, listing Cari as her reference. On November 16th, Cari's debit card was used to purchase nearly $400 worth of items at Omaha discount stores. Then in August 2013, Liz frantically called Krupa. Her house had been set on fire. Her pets perished in the blaze. Almost immediately, a message arrived from Cari's accounts. "I am not lying, I set that nasty house on fire." The shared trauma brought Krupa and Liz closer together, united against what seemed like a common enemy. Over 3 years, someone sent more than 50,000 text messages and 15,000 emails, all appearing to come from Cari Farver. The messages detailed what Krupa was wearing at specific moments, where he was going. Some arrived while he sat next to Liz, watching her hands. She clearly wasn't typing, yet messages kept coming. Nothing worked to stop them. In April 2015, Pottawatomie County Detective Ryan Avis and investigator Jim Doty took fresh interest in the case. They approached it from dual perspectives. Avis investigating as if Cari were alive, Doty assuming she was deceased. Enter Tony Cava, a cyber investigator with extraordinary technical expertise. He began tracing thousands of communications. What he uncovered was staggering. Messages allegedly from Cari were actually originating from devices and IP addresses connected to Liz Goler. Investigators discovered Liz's fingerprint on a mint container found in Cari's abandoned Ford Explorer. Then came the most damning evidence. While examining a microchip from Goler's old cell phone, authorities found a horrifying photograph. An image of a human foot in advanced decomposition. The foot appeared to belong to Cari Farver. The investigation revealed something even more twisted. Goler had created multiple fake personas online, sending emails posing as Amy Flora, Krupa's ex-partner, in which Flora confessed to stabbing Cari and burning her body. These emails were Goler's attempt to frame Flora for the crime. When Liz called authorities claiming Flora had shot her in the leg, investigators discovered Flora had an airtight alibi. Goler had shot herself. On December 22, 2016, more than 4 years after Cari vanished, Shana Goler was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and second-degree arson. The prosecution built their case almost entirely on digital forensics and circumstantial evidence. They had no body, no weapon, no eyewitnesses. Just an overwhelming mountain of electronic evidence documenting an obsession that spiraled into murder. The trial began in May 2017. Chief Deputy Attorney Brenda Beadle told the court this was a case of an obsessive woman who would stop at nothing to possess the man she wanted. Prosecutors presented testimony from 30 witnesses, detailing the elaborate digital charade Goler maintained for years. posing as Cari, sending threatening messages to herself, setting her own house on fire, even shooting herself in the leg to maintain the illusion that a dangerous Cari Farver was still out there. After hearing all evidence, Judge Timothy Burns delivered his verdict on May 24, 2017, guilty of first-degree murder and second-degree arson. He stated that overwhelming circumstantial evidence overcame the lack of a body. Cari Farver did not voluntarily disappear and drop off the face of the earth, Burns declared. Very sadly, she was murdered. On August 15, 2017, Shana Goler was sentenced to life in prison without parole, plus a consecutive 18 to 20 years for arson. Cari's mother, Nancy, wept as the sentence was read. She had spent years receiving fake messages from someone impersonating her daughter, each one a cruel reminder of her loss. In 2024, the case gained renewed attention when Netflix released Lover, Stalker, Killer, featuring the investigators who solved the case. The documentary became the #1 title on Netflix the day it premiered. Investigators established a scholarship fund at Iowa Western Community College in Cari's name for information technology students, ensuring her legacy honors her professional passion. Goler remains at the Nebraska Correctional Center for Women, maintaining her innocence. To this day, Cari Farver's body has never been recovered. While Shana Goler's case demonstrated how digital deception could mask murder for years, the next story proves that sometimes the most shocking crimes happen in America's heartland, when a college student's evening jog transforms into a tragedy that captivates an entire nation. Number 4. Christian Bahena Rivera, Brooklyn, Iowa, population 1,700, is the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where doors stay unlocked and runners feel safe on quiet country roads. On July 18, 2018, that sense of security shattered when 20-year-old Molly Tibbetts left her boyfriend's house for an evening jog and simply vanished. Within days, her face appeared on yard signs, store windows, and thousands of t-shirts across the community. The reward for information climbed toward $400,000. FBI agents flooded into town, but as weeks turned into a month with no trace of the vibrant college student, hope began fading into something darker. Molly Cecilia Tibbetts was a psychology major at the University of Iowa, preparing for her sophomore year with dreams of earning a doctorate and writing books someday. She worked at a children's day camp and maintained close relationships with family and friends. Her cousin Morgan Collum took particular pride in their Snapchat streak. They'd maintained it for over 600 consecutive days. That July evening, Molly was staying at her boyfriend Dalton Jack's house to dog sit while he worked on a construction project in Dubuque. A former cross-country runner, she set out for her regular jog around 7:30, wearing gym shorts, a black sports bra, and running shoes. Surveillance cameras captured her running past at exactly 7:48, appearing healthy and content. It should have been an unremarkable summer evening. When Molly didn't show up for work the following morning, alarms immediately sounded. Her phone was dead, her Fitbit unresponsive. By 6 that evening, family reported her missing. Morgan realized with dread that their Snapchat streak had broken. Molly hadn't responded to messages for the first time in over 600 days. The search effort exploded into a massive operation. 15 FBI agents arrived, then more. Investigators executed search warrants for her social media accounts and Fitbit data. Crime Stoppers established a reward fund that swelled past $200,000. Molly's mother, Laura Calderwood, spoke to media, her voice wavering but determined. "We believe that Molly is still alive, and if someone has abducted her, we are pleading with you to please release her." 30 to 40 investigators combed through hundreds of tips, searching ponds, fields, and wooded areas. Helicopters scanned from above. But as the investigation stretched past 2 weeks with no breakthrough, frustration mounted. Iowa Department of Public Safety Director Kevin Winker admitted the case was incredibly frustrating, but insisted investigators believed they would find her. Then, on August 16th, nearly a month later, Deputy Sheriff Steve Kivy spotted something crucial: a distinctive black Chevrolet Malibu with aftermarket modifications. Investigators had been searching for this vehicle after reviewing surveillance footage from July 18th. The cameras had captured not just Molly jogging, but also a black Malibu driving past repeatedly, over 20 minutes, circling like a predator. Lead investigator Trent Valletta later recalled, "If you wanted us to go find a black Malibu, we could find hundreds. This one was different." Kivy approached the vehicle. The driver was 24-year-old Christian Bahena Rivera, an undocumented immigrant from Mexico who had been working at Yerrabi Farms under the assumed identity John Bud since 2014. Coworkers described him as quiet and hardworking. During interrogation, Rivera initially denied everything, but eventually his story cracked. According to investigators, Rivera admitted he'd seen Molly running and found her attractive. He followed her in his vehicle, then parked and began running alongside her. Molly grabbed her phone and threatened to call police, telling him to leave her alone. Rivera said he became angry and then claimed he blacked out. His next memory, he told police, was driving with an earpiece from headphones in his lap, realizing Molly was in his trunk. He drove to a remote cornfield and carried her body approximately 20 meters into the stalks, covering her with corn leaves. On August 21st, Rivera led investigators directly to the location. An autopsy revealed she had been stabbed between 7 and 12 times in her chest, neck, and skull. Rivera's arrest ignited immediate political firestorm. Then President Trump seized on the case at a rally that evening, using Molly's death to argue for stricter immigration policies. The case became deeply politicized. Molly's family pushed back forcefully. Her father, Rob, wrote in the Des Moines Register, pleading with people not to appropriate his daughter's soul to advance views she believed were profoundly racist. The trial began in May 2021. Prosecutors built their case around surveillance footage showing Rivera's Malibu repeatedly circling Molly, his partial confession, and DNA evidence showing Molly's blood in his trunk. County Attorney Bart Claver told jurors, "When you examine this evidence together, there can be no other conclusion than the defendant killed Molly Tibbetts." Then Rivera took the stand with a shocking story. He testified that 2 masked men, one with a knife, one with a gun, had broken into his trailer and forced him at gunpoint to drive them around. He claimed these men were responsible for Molly's death. Prosecutors called this testimony a complete fabrication. Assistant Attorney General Scott Brown argued Rivera hadn't blacked out. He simply hadn't wanted to admit he'd stabbed her. After 7 hours of deliberations over 2 days, the jury reached their verdict on May 28, 2021. Guilty of first-degree murder. Rivera, wearing headphones as interpreters translated into Spanish, stood expressionless and nodded slightly as the verdict was announced. On August 30th, 2021, Judge Joel Yates sentenced Christian Bahena Rivera to life in prison without parole, the mandatory sentence for first-degree murder in Iowa. "Mr. Bahena Rivera, you and you alone forever changed the lives of those who loved Molly Tibbetts," he said. Molly's mother, Laura Calderwood's statement was read. "Molly was a young woman who simply wanted to go for a quiet run on the evening of July 18th, and you chose to violently and sadistically end that life." Rivera remains incarcerated at the Iowa State Penitentiary in Fort Madison. His conviction was upheld on appeal in 2023. For Molly's family, no verdict could ever restore what was taken. The daughter who would never walk down the aisle, never become a mother, never write those books she dreamed of creating. If the Molly Tibbetts case showed how a single evening jog could capture national attention, our next story proves that sometimes evil wears the mask of normalcy for decades, until investigators uncover a killing spree so calculated and cold-blooded that it would earn its perpetrator a place on death row as one of Iowa's most prolific predators. Number 5. Dustin Honkin. Some criminals eliminate witnesses to avoid prison. Dustin Honkin eliminated entire families. On a sweltering July day in 1993, 2 little girls, 10-year-old Candy and 6-year-old Amber Duncan, were playing in their swimsuits when a knock came at the door. Within hours, they would be kneeling in a wooded area outside Mason City, Iowa, executed with single shots to the back of their heads. Their only crime was being home when a meth kingpin came hunting for an informant. 27 years later, Honkin would become the first person from Iowa executed since 1963. Dustin Lee Honkin grew up in Britt, Iowa, the son of an alcoholic father with bank robbery convictions. Despite his troubled home life, Honkin was intelligent and gifted in mathematics. After enrolling in community college chemistry courses and earning an A-, Honkin saw a darker opportunity. He became fascinated with methamphetamine production, studying chemistry textbooks, reading scientific journals, and keeping meticulous records. His ambition wasn't just to cook meth, it was to build an empire. In 1992, Honkin enlisted his best friend Tim Cutcomb and moved to Arizona, borrowing $5,000 to purchase chemicals and equipment. Drawing on his chemistry knowledge, Honkin produced several pounds of nearly pure methamphetamine. Distributing through two Mason City dealers, Terry DeGius and Greg Nicholson. The operation generated hundreds of thousands of dollars. Honkin even considered expanding to the internet and writing a book about manufacturing meth. During one drug run, Honkin met Angela Johnson, who was dating DeGius. Johnson complained that DeGius was using too much product meant for sale and suggested she and Honkin work together directly. The two began a relationship that would descend into murder. On March 21, 1993, Honkin and Cutcomp were arrested on federal drug trafficking charges. While preparing for trial, Honkin discovered Greg Nicholson had turned informant. Nicholson had worn a wire and recorded Honkin arranging a drug deal. Authorities had found nearly 150 grams of pure meth in Nicholson's house, and he'd agreed to cooperate for leniency. When Nicholson learned Honkin knew, paranoia consumed him. His wife recalled that he prevented her from going outside, terrified of retaliation. Honkin initially informed the court he would plead guilty, but days before his July 1993 plea hearing, everything changed. On July 3rd, Angela Johnson obtained a gun permit. 4 days later, she purchased a Tech-9 9mm handgun. On July 26th, Honkin and Johnson went searching for Nicholson. They found him at the home where he'd moved in with his girlfriend, Lori Duncan, and her two daughters, Candy and Amber. Lori had no involvement in drugs and didn't know Nicholson was an informant. She was simply a single mother building a life. Her daughters were innocent children enjoying summer vacation. What happened next was methodical and merciless. Honkin and Johnson kidnapped all 4 people and transported them to a remote wooded area outside Mason City. Greg Nicholson and Lori Duncan were bound, gagged, and shot multiple times. The little girls, still wearing their swimsuits from playing on that hot summer day, were forced to kneel and were each shot once, execution style, in the back of the head. The bodies were buried in shallow graves. Honkin withdrew his guilty plea, planning to fight charges now that his primary witness had vanished. As the investigation continued, Honkin's other dealer, 32-year-old Terry DeGius, disappeared as well. Johnson lured him to a property where Honkin beat him savagely with a baseball bat and shot him. DeGius' body was buried separately, his skull fractured, with all potential witnesses eliminated. The initial federal drug charges were dismissed on March 21, 1995, exactly 2 years after his first arrest, because none of the witnesses could be located. Honkin appeared to have gotten away with murder. But on February 7, 1996, law enforcement executed a search warrant on Honkin's Mason City home and discovered a fully operational meth lab with detailed notes on drug manufacturing and methods for binding and gagging people. Honkin and Cutcomp were arrested again. This time, Cutcomp became an informant, wearing a wire during their pre-trial release. The breakthrough came in 2000, 7 years after the murders, when investigators planted a jailhouse informant who befriended Angela Johnson. Johnson drew a hand-drawn map showing where the bodies were buried. When investigators followed the map, they found the remains of all 5 victims exactly where Johnson had indicated. The adults showed signs of being bound and gagged before being shot multiple times. The children had each been shot once in the back of the head. Honkin was charged with 5 counts of murder in furtherance of a continuing criminal enterprise. Although Iowa had abolished the death penalty in 1965, this was a federal case, making Honkin eligible for execution. The trial in 2004 featured extraordinary security measures. The judge impaneled an anonymous jury to protect their identities. Honkin was fitted with a stun belt concealed under his clothing to prevent escape attempts. Honkin's attorney described him to jurors as basically a nerd who became infatuated with drug manufacturing, arguing his youth meant he could be rehabilitated. The prosecution countered with overwhelming evidence, testimony from informants, forensic analysis, and the damning map Johnson had drawn. In October 2005, Honkin was convicted on all counts and sentenced to death. Angela Johnson was tried separately and also sentenced to death, though a judge later reduced her sentence to life imprisonment. Honkin spent 15 years on death row at the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, Indiana. During that time, he reportedly found religion, working with Catholic nun Sister Betty Donahue. On July 17, 2020, at 4:36 p.m., Dustin Honkin was executed by lethal injection. He was 52 years old. As he lay strapped to the gurney, a Catholic priest stood nearby as his spiritual advisor. Honkin kept his eyes fixed on the ceiling, never looking toward witnesses. His final words maintained he had been redeemed and had repented. Federal Judge Mark Bennett, who had overseen Honkin's trial, said he generally opposed the death penalty, but believed Honkin deserved execution if anyone did. "It's just horrific how they were massacred," Bennett said. Susan Torres, the victim's aunt, who attended the execution, said, "He does deserve what he's getting. He deserved it a long time ago." Honkin became the first defendant in an Iowa case, executed since 1963, ending one of the most brutal chapters in the state's criminal history. For the families of Candy, Amber, Lori, Greg, and Terry, the execution brought some measure of justice, though nothing could restore the lives stolen on that summer day in 1993. While Dustin Honkin's case showed the calculated brutality of a drug kingpin willing to murder children to protect his empire, the next story reveals something far more personal, when 3 trials couldn't determine the truth about a woman found deceased in her own bed. Number 6. Seth Tekel. May 26, 2012, started like any other Saturday morning in rural Agency, Iowa. Then at 5:23 a.m., a frantic 911 call shattered the quiet. "My wife's been shot," Seth Tekel sobbed into the phone, his voice breaking between hysterical gasps. Responders rushed to the couple's trailer to find 23-year-old Lisa Tekel, deceased in her bed, 17 weeks pregnant with their first child, a daughter they planned to name Zoe Maria. Seth claimed an unknown intruder had broken in while he showered. But investigators would soon uncover secrets that told a very different story. What followed was extraordinary. 3 separate trials over 2 years, 2 hung juries, and a relentless pursuit of justice. Lisa Caldwell had met Seth Tekel as teenagers working at a local bowling alley. Lisa was a state champion bowler with natural athletic ability and a passion for the outdoors. After 7 years of dating, they married in October 2011, settling into a trailer on land outside Agency in Wapello County. Both had promising law enforcement careers. Lisa worked as a jailer at Washington County Jail and served as a reserve deputy, following her father, Todd Caldwell, a respected deputy with the Wapello County Sheriff's Office. Seth, a volunteer firefighter, was set to begin working as a jailer in the same department. From the outside, they appeared to be the perfect young couple. That Saturday morning, Seth told investigators he'd woken at 5 a.m. and gotten into the shower. Around 5:05, he heard what sounded like a gunshot. When he emerged, he noticed the outside door open and found Lisa unresponsive in their bedroom with a gunshot wound. He called 911 18 minutes later. Paramedics found no signs of forced entry or struggle. All 5 guns Seth kept in the house were accounted for. Deputy Marty Wonderland called Lisa's father, Todd, to the scene, a decision he later regretted. Todd Caldwell and his wife, Amy, rushed over. Amy ran inside. "I held her hand and I rubbed her belly and just said, 'My Lisa, my Lisa,'" she recalled. But it was too late. Lisa and her unborn daughter were gone. Seth immediately pointed investigators toward Brian Tate, their 56-year-old neighbor, a disabled veteran Seth described as his crazy neighbor because of ongoing property disputes. Tate suffered from mental illness and had been involved in heated arguments with the Tekels. On the surface, it seemed plausible. But as Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation agents dug deeper, inconsistencies in Seth's story began surfacing. When asked about extramarital affairs, Seth initially claimed he'd been texting a coworker named Rachel McFarland around January 2012, but insisted it was innocent, just casual messages. He said Lisa had found out, read them, and everything was fine. But during the interview, Seth kept amending his statements, revealing more about the relationship. Then investigators examined Seth's phone. What they discovered was explosive. Seth and Rachel McFarland, who worked together at Ottawa Job Corps, had been exchanging intimate text messages for months. Messages prosecutors would later describe as reading like a countdown to Lisa Tekel's death. The relationship had progressed to something physical, though Rachel testified it was never consummated. She believed she loved Seth, and Seth had become increasingly desperate to be with her, repeatedly promising he would divorce Lisa. But Rachel had begun expressing interest in another coworker named Brandon. When Seth learned Rachel was communicating with Brandon on May 20th, just 6 days before Lisa's death, he became jealous and pleaded with her. "Just give me 2 more weeks," he told Rachel. When she asked what he meant, Seth simply repeated, "Give me 2 more weeks." The explicit messages and photos continued right up until the day Lisa was found deceased. Investigators made another critical discovery. The murder weapon was a shotgun from the Teckles' own home, one Seth had failed to mention. Armed with this evidence and Rachel's testimony, authorities arrested Seth outside his wife's wake, using the same handcuffs Lisa had once worn as a reserve deputy. Seth's first trial began in February 2013 in Wapello County. The prosecution relied on circumstantial evidence, the affair with Rachel, the shotgun from their home, Seth's inconsistent statements, and the suspicious timeline. The defense hammered away at Brian Tate as an alternative suspect, pointing to his mental illness and the property dispute. After days of deliberation, the jury deadlocked. 11 voted to convict, 1 voted to acquit. A hung jury meant no verdict. The second trial was moved to Henry County in October 2013 due to publicity. The defense doubled down on Tate as the likely killer. Tragically, Brian Tate had passed away in September 2012 of probable heart failure, unable to defend himself. His family believed the negative publicity had broken his heart. This time, the jury deadlocked 9-3 in favor of conviction. Another hung jury, another mistrial. Prosecutors were undeterred. There was no question we would retry it, said Iowa Special Assistant Attorney General Scott Brown. The third trial began in July 2014 in Davenport. Both sides made strategic shifts. For the first time, the defense revealed that Lisa herself had been having an affair with a married co-worker, a fellow jailer. This bombshell suggested marital problems on both sides. But prosecutors argued this didn't change the fundamental facts. Seth had motive, means, and opportunity. Rachel McFarland took the stand for the third time, recounting how Seth had repeatedly told her he loved her and would leave his wife. Prosecutors presented the explicit messages in their entirety. The relationship with Rachel was evidence that was like a countdown to Lisa Teckles' death, prosecutor Andrew Prosser told jurors. After just 4 hours of deliberation over 2 days, the jury reached a unanimous verdict on July 27, 2014. Guilty of first-degree murder and non-consensual termination of a human pregnancy. Lisa's father, Todd Caldwell, wiped away tears as all 12 jurors affirmed the verdict. "I knew that justice would prevail," he said. "It's just a matter of how long it would take." At sentencing on September 10, 2014, Lisa's family finally confronted Seth directly. Her mother, Tracy, delivered a heart-wrenching statement. "Seth, I have no doubt that you made sure Lisa could not resist before you took her life. You and I both know that Lisa would have fought to survive so she and Zoe could have lived." Lisa's sister, Presley, who had once loved Seth like a brother, looked him in the eye and said, "I am no longer your sister, and I no longer love you." When Judge Daniel Wilson asked if Seth had anything to say, he replied coldly, "Not at this time." Wilson sentenced him to life in prison without parole, plus an additional 25 years. Seth Teckle, who had once hoped for a career in law enforcement, would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The case that required 3 trials and tested a family's strength for over 2 years finally reached its conclusion. For Todd Caldwell and his family, the verdict meant Lisa could finally rest, but nothing could bring back the daughter, sister, and mother to be stolen on that May morning. While Seth Teckle's case showed how persistence through 3 trials could eventually deliver justice, the next story proves that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the youngest. When 2 teenage boys turned a baseball bat into a weapon of unimaginable cruelty. Number 7, Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale, November 3, 2021, started with a missing person report in Fairfield, Iowa, a quiet town of about 9,000 people, 100 miles southeast of Des Moines. 66-year-old Nohema Graber, a beloved Spanish teacher at Fairfield High School, hadn't come home the night before. Her husband Paul reported her missing when she failed to return from her daily after-school walk. What searchers discovered in Chautauqua Park would shatter this tight-knit community. Graber's body hidden beneath a tarp, a wheelbarrow, and railroad ties in a wooded area. She'd been beaten to death with a baseball bat. The killers? 2 of her own students, 16-year-old boys who'd spent at least 2 weeks meticulously planning her murder. Their motive was as chilling as it was senseless: a bad grade in Spanish class. Nohema Graber had dedicated her life to education. Originally from Mexico, she'd spent decades teaching Spanish to generations of Iowa students, first in Ottumwa, before joining Fairfield High School. Those who knew her described a woman passionate about her craft, someone who believed teaching extended beyond conjugating verbs and memorizing vocabulary. At her memorial service just days after her death, her son Christian read from her personal notebook. "We, the teachers, must be a positive role model for our students. And even if the students forget about my Spanish classes, I hope they remember how and why to smile in life and be honest." Every afternoon after school, Graber followed the same routine. She'd drive her van to Chautauqua Park and take a walk along the trails. It was her time to decompress, to enjoy nature, to clear her mind after a long day with teenagers. On November 2nd, 2021, that peaceful routine would be her last. That same afternoon, Willard Miller, a junior at Fairfield High, met with Graber at school to discuss his poor grade in her class. Miller was frustrated. In a later police interview, he described his anger over the way Graber taught Spanish and how her grade was lowering his GPA. For an achievement-oriented student, a failing grade felt catastrophic. But rather than accept the consequences of his performance or seek help to improve, Miller had already set something far darker in motion. At least 2 weeks earlier, Miller had begun planning Graber's murder. He'd recruited his classmate and friend, 16-year-old Jeremy Goodale, to help. Together, they'd worked out the details: where to intercept her, what weapons to bring, how to dispose of evidence. Miller brought his own baseball bat. They chose Chautauqua Park, knowing it was where Graber walked every day. After Miller's meeting with Graber that afternoon, she drove to the park as usual, arriving around 4 p.m. Less than an hour later, witnesses saw her distinctive van leaving the park. But Graber wasn't driving. 2 young males sat in the front seats. The van was later found abandoned at the end of a rural road outside town. In those woods, Miller and Goodale ambushed their teacher. According to Goodale's later testimony in court, Miller struck first. After he had struck Nohema Graber, he then moved her off of the trail, where I then struck her, Goodale explained as he entered his guilty plea. She died as a result. The brutal attack left the 66-year-old woman with no chance of survival. The teens then dragged her body deeper into the woods, covering it with a tarp, wheelbarrow, and railroad ties they'd brought to the scene. They attempted to remove any evidence that could connect them to the crime. After the murder, Goodale called a friend for a ride. That witness later told investigators they'd picked up both Goodale and Miller as they walked along that rural road, the same road where Graber's van sat abandoned. The boys acted as if nothing had happened. When Graber didn't come home that evening, her husband Paul grew worried. She was always punctual, always reliable. By the next morning, when she still hadn't returned, he reported her missing. School officials joined the search. Volunteers combed Chautauqua Park. It didn't take long to find her van, and shortly after, searchers made the devastating discovery of her body hidden in the woods. Investigators from the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation immediately began piecing together Graber's final hours. The timeline was clear. She'd been at school that afternoon, then driven to the park for her walk. Her van had been seen leaving with 2 males inside. But who were they? The break in the case came from an unexpected source: Goodale's own classmates. Students came forward with evidence that pointed directly at the 2 16-year-olds. Some provided screenshots of Snapchat conversations where Goodale had made admissions about being involved in Graber's death. Conversations that implicated both himself and Miller by name. The witness identified Goodale as making statements that identify Goodale's admissions that he acted in concert with another person to bring about Graber's death, court documents later revealed. When police brought Miller in for questioning, his story kept changing. Initially, he denied any involvement whatsoever in Graber's disappearance. Then he claimed he had knowledge of everything but did not participate. Finally, he spun an elaborate tale. A roving group of masked kids had forced him to provide his wheelbarrow to help move the body and to drive her van from the park. It was a desperate lie that investigators immediately saw through. The evidence was overwhelming. The baseball bat belonged to Miller. Both teens had been seen in Graber's van. Goodale's Snapchat messages were damning. Witnesses had picked them up on that rural road, and prosecutors believed the motive was crystal clear: Miller's failing grade in Spanish class. On November 12th, in 2021, just 9 days after Graber's body was discovered, both Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale were arrested and charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Due to the severity of the crime, prosecutors charged them as adults, though Iowa law prohibited mandatory life sentences without parole for juveniles. The case moved slowly through the courts. Both teens initially pleaded not guilty, Miller's attorneys filed multiple motions to suppress evidence, arguing that search warrants were issued illegally. Defense strategies shifted as Goodale was listed as a potential state witness against Miller. The legal maneuvering continued for over a year. Then, on April 18, 2023, just days before Miller's trial was set to begin in Council Bluffs, both teenagers changed their pleas. In separate hearings at the Jefferson County Courthouse in Fairfield, both Miller and Goodale pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. Graber's family sat in the front row, finally hearing the truth. Goodale's testimony was chilling in its matter-of-fact tone. On November 2nd of 2021, I met Willard Miller at Chautauqua Park, and I understood that he had intent to kill Mrs. Graber. He brought a bat, among other supplies, to go through with the murder. Miller, for his part, admitted to planning and carrying out the killing, but continued to deny ever striking Graber himself, a claim prosecutors and Goodale contradicted. Sentencing hearings were scheduled separately. Miller appeared before Judge Sean Showers on July 5, 2023. By this point, Miller was 17. Prosecutors recommended a sentence between 30 years and life in prison. Graber's family delivered emotional victim impact statements. Her son Christian spoke of the hole left in their lives. Her brother-in-law, Tom Graber, noted that Nohema's husband, Paul, had passed away in 2023, telling the court, "I am certain from knowing Nohema for more than 35 years that she would have made Paul see the doctor much sooner for the new pains and skin lesions he was experiencing late last year. She would not have let him ignore these symptoms." Paul Graber had died without seeing full justice for his wife. Judge Showers sentenced Miller to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 35 years, citing the brutality of the premeditated murder. Certainly a high school junior who formulates a plan with his friend and murders his Spanish teacher is a dangerous person to the community, the judge stated. Jeremy Goodale's sentencing came months later, on November 15, 2023. Now 18, Goodale received life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years, 10 years less than Miller, reflecting prosecutors' belief that Miller had been the instigator. Both teens have since appealed their sentences, arguing that the courts failed to properly consider factors afforded to juveniles: their age, immaturity, and inability to fully appreciate consequences. In September 2024, the Iowa Supreme Court heard Miller's appeal, with his attorney arguing the 35-year minimum was excessive for a juvenile offender. The state countered that the crime was carefully planned and the sentence appropriate. In January 2025, Goodale's appeal was denied, with the court acknowledging he'd been influenced by Miller, but noting he was a bright student and intelligent teenager who could have stopped this from happening. Nohema Graber's murder over a bad grade stands as one of Iowa's most senseless tragedies. A dedicated educator killed by the very students she'd tried to teach, guide, and inspire. For Fairfield, a community that prides itself on tight bonds and small-town values, the betrayal cut deep. The case serves as a haunting reminder that sometimes danger doesn't come from strangers. It comes from those sitting right in the classroom. While Miller and Goodale planned their teacher's murder over a failing grade, our next case involves something even more incomprehensible: when a teenager turned his rage not on a teacher, but on his own family, wiping out everyone he'd grown up with in a single night of horror. Number 8. Alexander Jackson. The morning of June 15, 2021, started with a frantic 911 call from a quiet cul-de-sac in northeast Cedar Rapids, Iowa. "There's been a shooting," a young man's voice stammered. "A man broke in and shot me and my dad." When officers arrived at the upscale home on Oakleaf Court, they found something far more horrific. Inside lay 3 bodies: 61-year-old Jan Jackson, 68-year-old Melissa Jackson, and their 19-year-old daughter Sabrina, all shot to death in separate rooms. The only survivor was 20-year-old Alexander Jackson, the son who'd made that call, nursing a gunshot wound to his foot. He insisted a masked intruder had attacked his family. But investigators would soon conclude the real killer wasn't some phantom burglar. It was Alexander himself. This was Cedar Rapids' first triple homicide since 1982. The Jacksons appeared to have everything. Jan worked as a successful professional, and both Alexander and Sabrina were bright students attending the University of Iowa. Alexander had been an Eagle Scout with no criminal history. He'd played flute in his high school symphony band and was known as a polite young man who mowed neighbors' lawns. Sabrina was a high-achieving student who'd introduced then-presidential candidate Andrew Yang during his 2019 Iowa campaign visit. Neighbors described them as a friendly, normal family with no obvious problems. But beneath that surface, Alexander was drowning. His college grades had plummeted. His GPA was in free fall, and his bank account held just $30. His father, Jan, had recently delivered an ultimatum: get a job or move out. For a young man raised with high expectations who'd always succeeded, the prospect of failure and the shame of being kicked out may have felt unbearable. That Tuesday morning at 8:23, Alexander called 911. He told dispatchers a masked man had broken into their home and opened fire. According to his story, he'd woken to gunshots and was shot in the foot during a struggle over a rifle. The intruder fled out the back door. Alexander could only describe his supposed attacker as a black man wearing black clothing and green shoes. Vague details that immediately raised red flags. Officers found Jan with 5 gunshot wounds to his chest, neck, and back of his head, each individually fatal. Sabrina was discovered shot to death in her bed. Melissa was found on the master bedroom floor, shot multiple times, including once in her left eye at such close range that gunpowder soot was left on her skin. From the beginning, investigators were skeptical. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere, no furniture out of place, no evidence of a struggle. The neighbors across the street had Ring doorbell cameras, and footage showed absolutely no one entering or leaving the Jackson home that morning before police arrived. When investigators canvassed the neighborhood, nobody had seen or heard anything unusual. Then came the critical evidence. The murder weapon was a .22 caliber Browning rifle belonging to the Jackson family. Investigators found 2 clear palm prints on that rifle, both Alexander's. The box for the rifle was discovered under Alexander's bed. That particular Browning had an unusual loading mechanism, so unique that a Cedar Rapids crime scene investigator with years of firearms training had to search online for a video tutorial to learn how to load it. Prosecutors would argue a random intruder wouldn't know how to operate such a specialized weapon, but someone who lived in the house would. Medical examiners determined the shooter had to reload the rifle several times to inflict all the wounds, further suggesting someone familiar with the weapon. Blood spatter analysis provided another crucial piece. Investigators found blood near Alexander's bed, indicating he'd shot himself in the foot there, not downstairs during an alleged struggle, as he claimed. After treatment for his foot injury, Alexander was interrogated for hours by Cedar Rapids police investigators Matt Denlinger and Sarah Lucina. They asked about his college struggles, his relationship with his father, whether he was experiencing mental health issues. Alexander never wavered from his intruder story. When pressed about how an unknown burglar could break in without evidence, find a specialized rifle, know how to load it, and commit multiple murders without stealing anything, Alexander had no answers. "You can't sit there and look me in the eye and tell me that's what happened," investigator Lucina told him. But Alexander did exactly that. The same day, Alexander Jackson was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. He was held on $3 million bond. His trial began in January 2023. The prosecution presented their case: the palm prints, the lack of forced entry, the Ring camera footage, the unusual rifle requiring expertise, the blood spatter evidence, the motive of academic failure and financial desperation. First Assistant Lynn County Attorney Monica Slaughter told jurors Alexander had shot his father as he came down the stairs, then stood over him and fired 2 more shots into his head. He'd killed Sabrina in her bed while she slept, executed his mother at close range, then shot himself in the foot to stage his story. Slaughter pointed out something chilling from the 911 call. Alexander never once called out for his mother or sister to check if they were okay, because he already knew they were dead. Defense attorney Tyler Johnston maintained Alexander's innocence, arguing investigators had been sloppy and ignored potential evidence. He emphasized the Jacksons were a happy family with no history of conflict. He had no reason to harm his family, Johnston told jurors. After 6 hours of deliberation on January 25, 2023, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. Alexander Jackson, now 22, showed no reaction. As deputies handcuffed him, he appeared to tear up. Jan's sister, Kay Jackson, and her daughter, Danielle Jackson Parsons, read a statement. "Alex wanted the world to think he was a victim of this horrendous crime, but we know that is not the case. And now, everyone knows the truth. On March 3, 2023, Judge Lars Anderson sentenced Alexander Jackson to 3 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole, citing the horrific nature of the murders. In January 2025, the Iowa Court of Appeals upheld the convictions, finding overwhelming evidence of Jackson's guilt. The tragedy that destroyed the Jackson family remains one of Iowa's most disturbing cases. An Eagle Scout with a bright future who chose murder over facing failure, wiping out everyone who loved him in a desperate attempt to escape his problems. Number 9. Annette Cahill. Some murder cases are solved through forensic breakthroughs, DNA matches, fingerprint analysis, surveillance footage. But occasionally, justice hinges on something far more unusual. The 25-year-old memory of a 9-year-old girl who witnessed something she was never supposed to see. On October 13, 1992, 22-year-old Cori Wienecke was bludgeoned to death with an aluminum baseball bat in his rural West Liberty, Iowa home. The case went cold for over 2 decades. Then in December 2017, a nurse approached investigators with a disturbing story about black candles, sobbing apologies, and a confession whispered in the dark. Her testimony would lead to one of Iowa's most controversial convictions, a case with no DNA evidence, no fingerprints, and a first jury that voted 11-1 to acquit. West Liberty is the kind of small Iowa town where everyone knows everyone. In 1992, Cori Wienecke was one of its most beloved residents, a former high school football star known for his magnetic personality. He worked nights as a bartender at Wink's Bar and Grill, his family's restaurant, and was engaged to his high school sweetheart, Jody Hotz. They'd recently moved into a farmhouse outside town, but Cori had been involved in a year-long affair with 29-year-old Annette Hazen. On the night of October 12th, tensions exploded. Annette was waiting for Cori outside the bar after 2 a.m., but he left with another woman, Wendy Marshall. Annette was furious. She confronted him in a heated discussion, and according to her later statements, they had angry sex at his place before she left. The next morning, Jody left for work around 8:30. When she returned at 6:30 that evening, the screen door was open, their dog was outside unchained, and things were out of place. She found Cori lying face down on their bedroom floor, bloodied and battered. He'd suffered 13 blunt force injuries. The murder weapon, an aluminum baseball bat, was found the next day about a mile away. Investigators immediately focused on Annette. She had motive and had been one of the last people to see him alive. But Annette fully cooperated. She had an alibi through her sister-in-law, who said they'd been working a roofing job together that morning. Annette claimed she'd stopped by Cori's house to pick up a book, but he didn't answer. When asked to take a polygraph test, she passed. With no physical evidence linking her to the crime, the case went cold. For 25 years, Cori's murder remained unsolved. Annette moved to Tipton, Iowa, remarried, and became Annette Cahill. She had children and grandchildren, worked in newspaper production, and later for the Police Law Institute. She lived a quiet life with no criminal history. Then came December 2017. Iowa DCI agent Trent Valletta was at the University of Iowa Hospital on an unrelated case when a nurse named Jessica Becker approached him. When he mentioned he worked cold cases, she revealed she had information about an old murder, information she'd held for 25 years. Becker explained that in 1992, when she was 9, she'd been close friends with Annette's niece and frequently had sleepovers at the farmhouse where Annette lived with her brother's family. Shortly after Cori's murder, Becker was at a sleepover. She and her friend snuck downstairs late at night and saw something terrifying. Annette was in the dining room, lighting black candles, crying and sobbing, and she was apologizing to Cori. "Cori, I never meant to hurt you," Becker recalled hearing. "Cori, I'm so sorry. I never meant to kill you, Cori. I love you." The girls rushed back upstairs, terrified. Becker told her mother, Cynthia, what she'd witnessed, but they were scared. The Hazen family was well respected in West Liberty, and one family member was the sheriff. They never went to police. Now an adult working as an ICU charge nurse and U.S. Army Reserve officer, Becker finally felt ready to tell the truth. Investigators also discovered that Annette had allegedly told someone Cori had been killed with a baseball bat, before that information was public and even before the weapon was found. On May 31st, 2018, 55-year-old Annette Cahill was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Her first trial began in March 2019. The prosecution's case relied almost entirely on Jessica Becker's testimony. There was no physical evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, no blood, no fibers linking Annette to the scene. Defense attorney Clemens Erdahl hammered this repeatedly. He questioned whether Becker could have even seen Annette from the enclosed stairway. He brought up other potential suspects, including a man convicted of a similar bludgeoning murder the following year. After 6 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for 6 hours and deadlocked. 11 jurors voted to acquit, only 1 to convict. Judge Patrick McAleer declared a mistrial. A second trial was scheduled for September 2019. This time, prosecutors had a new witness, Scott Payne, described as a drug buddy of Annette's brother. Payne testified he'd seen Annette burning blood-stained clothing within days of the murder. When asked why he hadn't reported this, Payne said, "I tried to avoid the police as often as I could." The second jury deliberated for 16 hours. They told the judge they were deadlocked, but Judge McAleer ordered them to continue until they reached a unanimous verdict. On September 19, 2019, after being forced to keep negotiating, the jury found Annette Cahill guilty, not of first-degree murder, but of second-degree murder. In November 2019, she was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Annette has maintained her innocence throughout. Her attorneys argued her 14th Amendment rights were violated by the 26-year delay in prosecution, that DNA testing should have been required, and that the witnesses were unreliable. In March 2022, the Iowa Supreme Court denied her appeals, but the controversy hasn't ended, and the Drake University Wrongful Convictions Clinic has taken up her case. In 2023, her attorneys filed motions seeking to retest evidence for DNA, including the murder weapon, hairs found in Corey's hand, and bedding from the scene. Supporters argue this is a wrongful conviction, a grandmother imprisoned based solely on a childhood memory and questionable witness testimony without a single piece of physical evidence. Annette Cahill remains incarcerated at the Iowa Correctional Institution for Women in Mitchellville. Her case has been featured on Dateline NBC's The Black Candle Confession and Oxygen's Snapped, bringing national attention to one of Iowa's most polarizing convictions. Was Jessica Becker's memory accurate after 25 years? Or did the justice system convict an innocent woman? Whether you believe Annette Cahill finally faced justice or is a victim of flawed testimony, one thing is certain. Her case continues to spark fierce debate about memory, evidence, and the very nature of justice itself. But from the controversial conviction of Annette Cahill, we now turn to our final case, a story that brings us full circle to where we began, examining one of Iowa's most calculated killers who turned a farm tool into a murder weapon. Number 10, Todd Mullis. On a crisp November morning in 2018, a frantic 911 call came from a farm in rural Earlville, Iowa. "My wife fell on a corn rake," a man's voice reported, his tone urgent but controlled. He was already driving to the hospital, his severely injured wife bleeding in the vehicle. When emergency responders instructed him to pull over and begin CPR, the man complied. But by the time 39-year-old Amy Mullis reached the hospital, it was too late. She was pronounced dead from massive injuries to her back. Her husband, 42-year-old hog farmer Todd Mullis, claimed it was a horrible farm accident. His wife had simply fallen on the sharp implement while fetching a pet carrier from a shed. But when the emergency room doctor examined Amy's body, something didn't add up. The corn rake had 4 steel tines. Amy had 6 puncture wounds. What investigators would uncover was a calculated murder disguised as a farm tragedy. A jealous husband who'd rather see his wife dead than lose half his multi-million-dollar farm in a divorce. Amy Lynn Fuller was born in January 1979 and raised in the Eldora area of Iowa. After graduating from Eldora New Providence High School in 1997, she pursued nursing, earning her degree from Kirkwood Community College. She worked as a registered nurse at Unity Point St. Luke's Hospital in Cedar Rapids, and later at Regional Medical Center in Manchester. Friends and colleagues described Amy as vibrant, bubbly, and outgoing, someone who lit up every room she entered. Amy met Todd Mullis at the Delaware County Fair in 2003. Todd was a dedicated hog and soybean farmer with an expansive property in Earlville, featuring 2 massive hog barns, each about the length of a football field. They married, and Amy eventually left her nursing career to help raise their 3 children and work on the farm operation. From the outside, they appeared to be the quintessential farming family. But beneath that surface, the marriage was fractured. In 2013, Amy had her first affair, shattering Todd's trust. Friends said Todd became increasingly controlling afterward, monitoring Amy's movements, timing her when she left and returned home, dictating which friendships were approved. One friend nicknamed Amy Pot, prisoner of Todd. Another described her as feeling like a slave or a hostage on the farm. By 2018, Amy was having another affair, this time with Cari Farver, a hog farm field manager who worked on the Mulleys' property. Amy confided in friends that she wanted to leave Todd but was terrified of his reaction. If he ever found out about the affair, she would disappear, Farver later testified. Even more chilling, Amy told one friend, "If I'm ever found dead, you'll know Todd did something to me." In October 2018, Amy's worst fears materialized. Todd discovered the affair. Amy called a friend, screaming and crying. The tension on the farm became unbearable. On the day of her death, November 10th, Amy texted a friend, "Still very tense around here, just not sure of anything anymore." That same day, just days after Amy had undergone surgery, the family was working on the farm. Amy, Todd, and their 13-year-old son Tristan were in one of the hog barns. Todd later told investigators Amy was having dizzy spells and asked her to walk to a nearby red shed to fetch a pet carrier for some kittens. He instructed her to set the carrier by the shop before coming back. When Todd didn't see the pet carrier appear, he asked Tristan to check on Amy. Moments later, the teenager's screams echoed across the farm. He'd found his mother face down just inside the shed doorway, a corn rake protruding from her back. Todd told investigators he rushed to the shed, saw the rake embedded in Amy's back, and because the shed opening was so narrow, he had to remove the corn rake to get her out. He described himself as a doer who wanted to get her help immediately. He loaded Amy into his truck and drove toward the hospital while calling 911. At the emergency room, Dr. Craig Thompson, the medical director of emergency services, who also worked as a medical examiner, examined Amy's injuries. He was told it was a freak accident, that she'd fallen on an upended corn rake. But when he counted the wounds, alarm bells went off. She had 6 puncture wounds across the back, Dr. Thompson later testified. "I found it very difficult to see how 4 tines could cause 6 holes in a single impact." State medical examiner, Dr. Abang Kelly Cruz, conducted the autopsy and made another critical discovery. 2 of the puncture wounds were at an upward angle and 4 were at a downward angle. This was physically impossible from a single fall. Amy had been struck at least twice, maybe 3 times, with the corn rake. Dr. Cruz ruled the death a homicide. Delaware County investigators began digging deeper. They interviewed Amy's friends and learned about her affair with Cari Farver, her desire to leave Todd, and her fears for her safety. They discovered the farm was worth millions of dollars. A divorce would have meant Todd losing half of everything he'd worked for. Then came the smoking gun, Todd's iPad search history. Just 4 days before Amy's death, someone using Todd's iPad had searched organs in the body. In the months prior, the searches became even more sinister. Killing unfaithful women. What happens to cheaters in history? What happened to cheating spouses in historic Aztec times? And perhaps most chilling, thrill of the kill. On February 28, 2019, nearly 4 months after Amy's death, Todd Mullis was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He was held on $5 million bail. His trial began in September 2019 in Dubuque County after a successful change of venue. The most anticipated witness was Todd and Amy's now 14-year-old son, Tristan, who testified via closed-circuit TV. Everyone knew the stakes. Tristan had provided his father's alibi from the beginning, claiming they'd been together in the hog barn office. But under questioning, Tristan admitted he'd lost sight of his father briefly when he left to get a drink of water. He couldn't say exactly how long he was gone. That window, however small, gave Todd the opportunity to slip out unnoticed, ambush Amy in the shed, stab her multiple times with the corn rake, and return to the barn before sending Tristan to find her. Cari Farver testified about his affair with Amy and her fears. "She said she felt like a slave or a hostage around there," he told the jury. One time, she said if he ever found out, she would disappear. Then, in a stunning move, defense attorney Jake Feuerhelm told the jury there was no doubt Amy Mullis was viciously and deliberately murdered. But he argued they couldn't be certain Todd was the killer. Perhaps someone else had surprised Amy in that shed. Todd took the stand in his own defense. Under cross-examination by Assistant Attorney General Maureen Hughes, he made a devastating admission. Amy's death was not an accident, and someone had stabbed her with the corn rake 2 to 3 times. When asked about the iPad searches, Todd claimed his wife and children sometimes used the device, but he couldn't explain the searches away. After nearly 8 hours of deliberation, over 2 days, the jury reached their verdict on September 24, 2019, guilty of first-degree murder. Todd Mullis rolled his eyes as the verdict was read. He was shackled and led from the courtroom. In September 2020, Todd Mullis was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole and ordered to pay $150,000 in restitution. He immediately requested a new trial, claiming ineffective assistance of counsel because his attorney hadn't pursued the accidental death theory he wanted. His appeals were denied. The Iowa Court of Appeals found the greater weight of credible evidence establishes Todd was vengeful over Amy's infidelity. He researched how to kill his wife on the internet. He planned her murder to avoid losing his farm in a divorce. Amy Mullis's murder became the subject of CBS's 48 Hours episode, The Corn Rake Murder, bringing national attention to the case that shocked rural Iowa. For the 3 children left behind, including the teenage son who discovered his mother's body, the tragedy was unimaginable. Their father is serving life in prison for murdering their mother with a farm tool, all because he valued land and money more than human life. Todd Mullis joins the long list of Iowa killers who believe they could get away with murder by staging accidents or blaming others. But just like the others we've examined today, the evidence told a different story, one of premeditation, jealousy, and cold-blooded violence that no amount of lies could cover up.